if anything controls the human race, it's money. So I felt compelled to cover this subject. Now, I just want you to imagine that suddenly the world has ended and all that's left is this room of people. And I want you to imagine that everyone takes off their jewellery to sell it. And I give every person in this room £10. So that's all that's left. You've all got £10 and you've all got some jewellery to sell. What would happen? Well, each item of jewellery would establish a price and a value. And that value would be largely determined by the 70 people in this room. The total amount of money in the room would determine the value of each item of jewellery. Now, if I then added another £70, so I give you all another £10, would you all be twice as well off? You wouldn't, because there's the same amount of wealth in the room. There's still the same amount of jewellery in the room. We're not any wealthier. We've got twice as much money. It just means that each pound is worth half of what it was. So if you double the amount of money in an economy, you halve the value of every pound. And that's what inflation is called. So if you double the amount of money in the British economy tomorrow, prices would all double immediately because of inflation, and your pound in your pocket will be worth half of what it is. So the amount of wealth in an economy is determined by the amount of stuff and not by the money itself. So that's a key point to get across. Because if I was to, that second £700, or that second lot of money that I was to add to the economy, if I could give it to half of you, not the others, the people who had the £10, they've still got £10, but that £10 is worth half of what it was. So you've kind of taken wealth from them by adding money to the other half of the economy. So the key points I'm trying to make is that what determines the value of each pound is the total amount of money in circulation and the total amount of goods in circulation. Inflation is caused by adding currency to an economy. And obviously adding currency to an economy devalues the money in the economy. And the other thing to point out is that our money today, we call it fiat currency because the paper actually has no value. It's not like it was in the past when we had gold. The goods and services that have the value, not the money. And banks don't create any wealth when they print money. The wealth comes from the workers of the country. Banks never create wealth by printing money. Okay, now it's a very important principle that by adding money into the economy devalues the value of the pound in your pocket. And bear that in mind throughout this presentation. Now, I'm just going to go through the history of why money was created and what its function was originally. Now, a long time ago, they had the barter system. So let's say I was a chicken farmer. I would go into the market, I've got my chickens, and I wanted some potatoes. So I'll give you 2 chickens for a bag of potatoes. And that's how it worked. People would swap goods. So they bartered for things. But that was a bit inconvenient because if I want potatoes, but the guy who's got potatoes doesn't want chickens, then you're in a bit of a problem. It means you've got to swap them for something else, and then it gets complicated. So something which was of intermediary value was introduced, and that was money. Now, it started off with precious metals and coins. And money, the sole purpose of money when it was first originated was to facilitate the exchange of goods and services, period. That's what money is for. It's so that you can easily get rid of what you've made and then obtain something what someone else has made. And I would argue that if money is used for anything other than that, that's when you get problems. And as I said, precious metals became the obvious choice for money because it had high value and it was small, could be easily carried around. And obviously gold is more rare than, say, copper, so a gold coin will be worth more than a copper coin. And the money itself had value because it was a precious, rare metal. Now, where paper money started out, it started out as promissory notes. So imagine I'm the chicken farmer and I go to the market. I've left me chickens at the farm. And the guy says, oh, I'll have 10 chickens off you. Well, why don't I just write on a piece of paper, I promise to pay the bearer of this piece of paper 10 chickens if you come to the farm, rather than me cart them to you in a truck. So I give him that piece of paper. So that's what a promissory note is. Now, the guy might think, oh, I don't need these chickens. So he then sells that promissory note to someone else. Then he sells it to someone else. So the chickens have changed hands 5 times, but the chickens have never left the farm. Okay? Now that's fine, that system works. But you can see the flaw, the temptation, is the chicken farmer writes a few too many promissory notes. And what's going to happen then? Let's say he's got 100 chickens and he writes 200 chickens worth of promissory notes. And they all come to collect their chickens at the same time. He's going to be in deep shit. So you would then have to devalue the chicken promissory note. So he would be very unpopular then. So this is the flaw in a promissory note system, but in principle, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, in the 1600s, the promissory note system and the coin system, they came together with the advent of goldsmiths. Now, goldsmiths, what they did was they worked with gold, they cast gold. Because they worked with these precious metals, they had the best safes in the world to keep that money in. Here's an example of one here, 16th century safe. So people who had a lot of gold and a lot of precious coins, they would say to the goldsmiths, can you keep my money in your safe because it'll be better for me, you know, I don't want to get burgled. Now, so the goldsmiths started getting more and more people's money, not their money, other people's money. And then one day, one goldsmith said, oh, well, I can lend out this money. It's not my money, but that doesn't matter. So they started lending out the gold to other people. Okay? So what have you done when you do that? If you lend one gold coin out, you've effectively added money into the economy, which devalues everyone else's money. But not only that, these goldsmiths, they started lending out the gold more than once. How did they do that? They give promissory notes. So when someone came to borrow some gold, they would say, well, will you just take this promissory note? And then they would write another promissory note to someone else for the same piece of gold. So they're increasing the amount of money in the economy through promissory notes. And typically, they would lend out 4 to 5 times more than what they had in the safe. And as long as the goldsmiths didn't get too greedy and everyone didn't come at once to collect their gold, it would work. Now, but the goldsmith was also charging interest. So he's taken someone's gold, he's loaned it out 4 or 5 times, and he's getting interest on that. Now, does that sound fair to you? Does that sound fair to anyone in this room? And this is why the goldsmiths became the richest people in the world. And guess who became the kings of the banking? The people who started this system. The goldsmiths became the bankers. And guess what? When that system first started, the first goldsmith who started lending out other people's money, it should have been ended there and then because the system is flawed. The reason why the system is flawed is because the goldsmiths become the richest people in the economy because they're getting all this interest, yet they're the only ones not doing any work. And they're the richest people. The other reason why it's flawed is because it adds discriminatory amounts of additional currency into the economy, which devalues everyone's pound in everyone's pocket. So in my view, they have a word for this. This is what the official system is now that we have. It's called the fractional reserve system, and this is how they create money now. They should have scrapped it in the 1600s. So the only difference now is that it's not actual real gold that they work with. The Bank of England, the central bank, which has the authority to create new currency, it presses a button on a computer, creates a whole load of new money. That is then deposited with the commercial banks, banks that we can go in and use. The commercial banks then lend out a very high percentage of that money, typically 9%. Eventually, that money comes back into most people who get money, they redeposit it with a bank, and then they lend out 90% of that. So typically, for every pound the central bank deposits, you get 10 times the amount into the economy. So it reduces the value of everyone's money. But what's the net effect? The net effect is that the banking system as a whole becomes the richest part of the economy because it's getting interest on all of those multiplied loans. This is the system we have today. Now, in order to try and, put the reins on this system, they brought in what's called the gold standard, where every promissory note in the economy was supposed to be backed by gold. So if you had a pound note in your pocket, you could go and get that piece of gold, and there would be a piece of gold equivalent to all the amount of money in the economy. But I don't think there's any economists would say that all of the gold ever covered the paper money that was in the economy. It never really worked. And this is where the expression "as good as gold" comes from. The note in your hand is as good as the gold that's in the bank. And as I said, this became the official system, this fractional reserve, as it's called. That's how new money is created. And it was made official in 1694 when they created the Bank of England, which is a very curious thing. And it's something which we very rarely see challenged on our mainstream television, whether we need the Bank of England. And more poignant, who owns the Bank of England? Just in order to get a grip on this, I'm going to briefly run through an economy, what I believe is an economy. Now, imagine that's you, okay? We're going to try and build an economy around this person. Well, everyone generally has some money. So I'm going to give him a bucket to keep his money in. Now, let's say this person works for this company, and the company's got a bucket with its money in. Let's put some money in it. So every week or every month, this company empties some money from its bucket into your bucket, so you get paid. So then what happens? Well, you probably spend some of that money on things that you need to live. So the money goes from your bucket back into industry's bucket, the private sector, retailers, people who make things. But of course, we've got governments, local authority and central government, and probably, I would estimate, around about half of everyone's money who pays taxes ends up back in the government's coffers. So there's the government's bucket, the money goes round to the government. And of course, companies have to pay taxes as well, so money goes out of the private sector's bucket into the government's bucket. What about people who work in the public sector? Well, they have money too. Hospitals, doctors, nurses, firemen, policemen, people who work in the public sector, they get paid by the government. But of course, they have to pay taxes as well. So the money goes round and round and round. Now, the system I've drawn there doesn't have a bank in it. What is a bank for? In my opinion, a bank, because we've got money flowing around that system all the time. It goes into your bucket and into someone else's bucket. It's being transferred. It's like an engine with oil in it. That's what money is. Now, a bank, in my opinion, should be, if there's a blockage, if there's some money, if money dries up in one part of that system, you would need to feed money in where there's a shortage. It's like a reservoir which its level changes. That's, in my mind, that's what the function of a bank is. So money comes out of the bank and it goes into private industry and it goes into individuals who want to have loans to buy houses or to buy cars. But of course we know that eventually that money has to be paid back. Now, who's creating the wealth in this system? Is it the bank? It's not the bank. Is it the government? It's the people who do the work. People who work in the public and private sectors. Equally as important. Now, so we've got this system where money's going round and round and round. Now, in that system, you'll notice one thing I haven't mentioned yet is interest. I'm not considering interest at this point. I'm saying that the bank is there to account for shortfalls in the flows when we get blockages. Okay? Now, just consider for one moment, we've got that system, it's working nicely. Just consider interest. So the bank then starts charging interest. So every piece of money that flows out, it wants extra money back in addition to the amount that it loaned out. Now, there's a word for this. It's called usury. And usury is actually illegal in some religions. In Islamic religion, they think that borrowing money for interest is fundamentally wrong and flawed. Now, when we consider interest in our society, it is accepted as necessary as breathing the air. And this is something we've got to get out of, because in my opinion, it's the fractional reserve system and interest which creates the boom-bust economy. All right? So just think about that. Question interest. No one ever questions interest on the BBC News, the fact that we could do away with it. And I'll explain how I think we could do away with it. The famous artist Francis Bacon once said, "Usury dulls and damps all industries, improvements and new inventions, wherein money would be stirring if it were not for this slug." And that's what interest is. It's a slug. It's a leech on society because it's not actually adding any wealth into the economy. Now, if the bank starts charging interest, so every piece of money which flows out flows back with extra money, is that sustainable? Because what's going to happen is eventually all of the money is going to end up in the bank. And there's going to be none in the economy. And this is why in our current economic system, money has to be continually added in. I'll come on to how money gets added into the economy later, but money is continually added into the economy. And this is because we have this leech on the side. Now, and as I said before, adding that money into the economy, what does it do? It devalues the very pound in your pocket. As soon as you add in £1 of money into an economy, it devalues the pound that you've got. This is why we have inflation. This is why in almost all economies we have inflation, because there's extra money being put in. Now, if the banks didn't charge interest, you could easily control inflation. So just hypothetically, we've done away with interest. A government can either add in or take money out of the economy quite easily. How it can add money, it can just print it and use that money to pay its public sector. It can take money out of the economy by taxing more. So the government can control how much money is in that economy. And by doing that, could control inflation easily, keep inflation at zero. And you wouldn't need to put your money in the bank because you wouldn't have. The reason why people put the money in the bank is because it gets devalued because of inflation and they need to earn interest. You wouldn't need to put your money in a bank. How can we have banks without interest? It's very simple. All you do is move the system of banking into the public sector, because that's what banks are. They're providing a public service. So banks basically become nationalized. And I'm not talking about being a communist or even a socialist, because this is still a free market economy where the engine is the private sector creating wealth. You just get rid of all of these bankers who are incredibly rich, and you make the public sector basically administer all loans. Now, but it's not as simple as that, because where does new money come from? In the diagram I've drawn here, I've said that the government can just create it. Well, that's not quite true, and this is part of the problem. Let's ask the question, where does new money come from? Well, it comes from the central bank, as I explained earlier, which actually, well, there's argument over whether the government owns it. A lot of people think it's owned by private shareholders, but it's created under a royal charter, which means it doesn't have to declare its shareholders. Some people say it's owned by the Queen and the Rothschilds. Now, as I mentioned before, this fractional reserve system, the central bank, the Bank of England, deposits money in the banks, and they then multiply that money up and charge interest. The central bank can also add debt money into the economy by loaning it to the government through things called, for example, quantitative easing. About a year ago, I believe, the Bank of England bought bonds and other assets from the government at £200 billion. That's money the government's got to pay back to the Bank of England. But the Bank of England just press a button on a computer and it just appears. Is that fair? And all this debt money that's added into the economy devalues the pound in your pocket. So, now another method that debt money has managed to get itself into the economy is through an inflated housing market. Let's say you've got a house worth £200,000. Most houses now that are worth £200,000 probably cost about £50,000 to build. But people are quite happy to pay £200,000. So why are they happy to pay £200,000 for something that costs £50,000 to build? Because they go, well, that's its market value, so I can therefore sell it. Okay, but what this has done, this mindset, it's allowed the central bank to feed more debt money to the banks through the fractional reserve system. So what happens? They do this on credit cards as well. We can show this in our model. The green indicates money going round and round the system, which isn't debt money. Over time, 10, 20 years, more and more of the economy's money is actually debt money. In other words, it doesn't belong to the people who hold those buckets. It belongs to the central bank or the banking system. And eventually, all the money in the economy turns red. It's debt money. Now, I would argue that nearly everyone in this room is in debt. I think we're all in debt. You say, no, well, I've got a £200,000 house and I've only got a £100,000 mortgage, and you're in debt. Because if they wanted to pull that money out of the economy that they've loaned everyone, suddenly your house will be worth 60 grand. And if you owe 100 grand on your house, you're in debt. Because if the economy collapsed, your house could easily be worth less than that. But not only that, the government's in debt. The government's national debt currently is £1,000 billion. Well, let's put that in perspective. That's £40,000 for every single house. And where's the government getting that from? You. So your house is in debt for 40 grand, plus you're probably in debt if you've got a house. This is why I'm saying we're all in debt, even though you don't think you are. And the interest that the government pay per household is £1,750 per year. And that's totally unnecessary. It's basically enslaving you. And it's unnecessary. It doesn't need to be that way. And remember, he who borrows sells his freedom. So if you're in that situation, if you're part of that situation, you're selling your freedom. Just try and illustrate it. Imagine there's a desert island and we all go there. We set up our little economy. We build a little money-making press. Some people work and build the houses. Some people are doctors and nurses, and we've got a bank. It's not charging interest. Great. But one day, the guy who's operating the money printing press, he says, oh, there's another island nearby. I'm going to go and live on that. Sure, no problem. Print your money over there. Just send the money across to us on a boat every month. And then he says, oh, I don't want you to pay me £15,000 a year salary. What I want you to do is I want you to pay me 5% continually on every note that I send you. All right then. So he sends £100 and he gets £5 a year on that. Then he sends another, and the economy grows and grows and grows. Eventually, this man owns more money than the entire island put together. He says, oh, will you come and build me a palace on my island? I want a Ferrari, I want this. He's the richest man, and he does no work. That's our current system. Now, there is an alternative to this. It's called the full reserve banking system, which is where you put money in a bank, it can't be loaned out. Borrowing has to be organized in a different way. And there are many economists who actually support this view. I'm not going to read all of that text. Other complicating factors are things like bonds. The government lends money off its own people by issuing bonds to them. In my opinion, that complicates the system. Now, derivatives is another one, a huge complicating factor. Some people think they should be illegal, and it takes a bit of getting your head around. Derivatives are a bit like kind of an insurance or gambling. I'll just briefly explain what a derivative is. They're split into broadly two types, options and futures. So let's just say I'm considering buying a commodity, a ton of cheese, let's say, right? Don't know if you can buy derivatives for cheese, but let's just say you can. If you buy an option for cheese, you buy a piece of paper which says that you have the option to buy that cheese at a fixed price on or before a particular date. You don't have to buy it, so the price of the cheese is fixed because you've bought this piece of paper. All right? Now, if the price of the cheese goes up between now and the time that the option expires, then you've won because you buy the cheese at the original fixed price and then sell it again at the market value. If it goes down, you've lost. Now, people buy and sell these options. You could buy an option without ever having an intention of buying the cheese. And because you've bought something which seemingly has value, even though you've got no intention of buying the cheese, new money gets introduced into the economy. And these have been used to inflate the economy with debt money. People who are making their living buying and selling derivatives, what are they adding to an economy? Are they creating any wealth? It's completely unnecessary. And again, a huge complicating factor in all of this, which keeps the truth away, is the media, because they don't address any of the issues that I'm putting forward in this presentation. What they do is they never question the actual economic system of usury and the fractional reserve system. That's just, well, that's the way it is. Of course it's the way it is. They never question it. And their news programs always start with a set of flawed assumptions, which is that government debt must be repaid. The debt was caused by the last government. This is a great thing that they love doing. They love blaming the previous government for the debt, because people think it's a political issue then. But they don't question the system, because all successive governments essentially have the same system. And that recessions are just caused by economic cycles up and down, and we can't control them. What a load of bollocks. And that everyone must suffer. This is the thing that they put across. We must all suffer. These things are out of our control.
David Cameron has used the starkest language yet to describe how dealing with a record deficit would change our whole way of life. Mr. Cameron said the deficit was even worse than he'd expected. Labour say their actions in government prevented a recession from turning into a depression. As our political editor Nick Robinson reports, Mr. Cameron appears to be setting the scene for the pain that will come with a budget that is now just 2 weeks away.
Cuts are coming. They're unavoidable. They'll affect us all. So soon, people may be asking, will my pay be cut? Or will I lose my job? Others may wonder, what about my benefits? And what will the cuts mean to me?
Because the legacy we've been left is so bad, the measures that we need to deal with it will be unavoidably tough.
We're in debt, aren't we? So yeah, it needs to cut spending, but I'm not quite sure exactly where, because someone's going to lose out, so I'm not quite sure where would be the best place to cut it, really.
Labour say the pain must be shared fairly, and they insist that so far it's not being.
Nobody is in any doubt about the need to bring the deficit down, but we're saying, look, let's bring the deficit down in a way that's fair. And everything that the coalition has done in the first month of office has actually been to hit people who can least afford it hardest.
Well, the Prime Minister's speech gave no specific details of where the cuts are likely to be made. Our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders, has been looking at some of the options. Stephanie.
Thank you, George. Well, it's not news that the government's borrowing a lot, but the Prime Minister's right that his situation is unique. No British government since the war has ever had to tackle a budget deficit that was quite this big.
What do you think? What's the thinking behind painting all this in such a stark way?
Making it easier to take the tough choices, George. Just listen to the words that shone out from the Prime Minister's speech today. There were three that I picked out. Unavoidable, legacy, and together. Unavoidable, he's really saying I've got no choice but to make these cuts. Legacy, saying not my fault, it's the other lot's fault. It's their fault because they left the economy in such a mess. And together, he's saying we've all got a responsibility to do this.
Yeah, we're all in this together, eh? And there are external complicating factors relating to the international economy. And one of them is intergovernment borrowing, because governments borrow off each other. And in this next clip, you might think this is a comedy clip, but every figure in this clip is actually correct.
Your name is Roger, yes?
Roger.
Ah, that's your name.
Roger.
Good. And what do you do, Roger?
I'm a financial consultant.
Ah, financial consultant, eh?
Roger,
yeah,
yes.
Terrific. And Roger, how's business at the moment?
Not bad, thank you. Been a bit quiet lately.
How do you mean lately?
Since the war, been a bit quiet.
Fair enough. OK, Roger, your special subject tonight is the economies of the European community. Your time starts now. Best of luck.
Thank you.
How much does Greece owe, Roger?
$367 billion.
Correct. And who do they owe it to?
Mostly to the other European economies.
Correct. How much does Ireland owe?
$865 billion.
Correct. And who do they owe it to?
Other European economies, mostly.
Correct. How much do Spain and Italy owe?
$1 trillion each.
Correct. Who to?
Mainly France, Britain and Germany.
Correct. And how are Germany, France and Britain going, Roger?
Well, they're struggling a bit, aren't they?
Correct. Why?
Because they've lent all these vast amounts of money to other European economies that can't possibly pay them back.
Correct. So what are they going to do?
They're going to have to bail them out.
Correct. Where are they getting the money to do that, Roger?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one.
how much does Portugal owe?
Hang on a minute. What was the answer to that earlier question?
Just keep answering the questions, Roger. Where is Portugal going to get the money it owes to Germany if Germany can't get back the money that it lent to Italy?
Just a minute. What was the answer to the previous question? The question was, how can broke economies lend money to other broke economies who haven't got any money because they can't pay back the money the broke economy lent to the other broke economy and shouldn't have lent it to them in the first place because the broke economy can't pay it back?
You're wasting very valuable time, Roger. How much money does Spain owe to Italy?
$41 billion, but where are they going to get it?
Correct. What does Italy owe to Spain?
$27 billion, but they haven't got it. They're broke.
Correct. How can they pay each other if neither of them has any money?
They're going to get a bailout, aren't they?
Correct. And where's the money coming from for the bailout?
That's what I'm asking you.
Correct. Why are people selling the European currency and buying the US dollar?
Because the US economy is so much stronger than the European economy.
Correct. Why is that, Roger?
Because it's owned by China.
Borrowing between countries complicates the issue, and if you notice there, they were quoting everything in dollars, and dollars is the world currency, which is to do with buying and selling oil, and I would argue that that's another complicating factor. And governments also borrow from other organisations, such as the World Bank and the IMF. There are some countries who are less affected by what's termed the international recession, such as Sweden. In Sweden, they have their own currency, and they are probably less connected to the international economy than most other European economies, and they've been less affected. So how could the system be changed? Well, there is something which has been around for a long time called the mathematically perfected economy, and I suppose this is essentially what I've been describing. Now, one thing that they use in the mainstream, I call it the phony bone of contention in order to spin their lies. And I've actually come up with a couple of definitions for the phony bone of contention. Controversy and discussion over two seemingly opposing viewpoints is encouraged in order to divert attention away from a third viewpoint which is being concealed. Okay, and I'm going to give an example of this. One program which makes very good use of the phony bone of contention is Question Time, or questionable time, with the completely disgusting David Dimbleby. He's not there chairing an open and honest debate. He is there to make sure that the phony issues are stayed on. He's there to make sure that the real answers are not discussed. So I've got an example here of a question from Question Time. So let's just have a look at this question.
Thank you. Our first question is from Lindsay Johnson, please.
Should we applaud the Chancellor for his steadfastness, or should we decry him for his stubbornness?
Good question.
Is it? Let's just have a look at it. Should we applaud the Chancellor for his steadfastness, or should we decry him for his stubbornness? Now, that question's been flowered up a little bit, but I'm going to explain exactly what the questioner means. By steadfastness, they mean austerity measures, because the Chancellor is supposedly introducing austerity, so he's increasing taxes and he's cutting back on government spending. So that's what they mean by steadfastness, austerity measures. Decry him for his stubbornness, what that means is some people are wanting him to borrow more money and inject that into the economy in order to try and stimulate growth. So he's being stubborn because he's refusing to borrow more money. And that's it. They're the only two solutions to the economy that they're going to have in that discussion. They're going to have austerity measures or more borrowing. Which do you want? Which do you want to choose? You can have austerity measures or borrowing, and that's your lot. You can't have any more debate about other solutions to the economic problems. What should the questioner have asked if this was a proper debate? How about, what does the panel think could be done to address the current financial situation? The original question limits the debate to two possible alternatives, neither of which provide a real solution to the problem. Austerity measures bleed you dry. More borrowing just gets you further into debt. Neither of those are solutions to the economic problems, in my opinion. I'll just give you a simple analogy. It's not a perfect one, but it's the best I could think of. Let's say I'm a taxi driver, and my car's only getting 10 miles to the gallon, right? But I work out that I'm still making a profit. So I think to myself, right, I know what I'll do. I can work 18 hours a day, and I'll just make enough to live. And I think, no, what I'll do is I'll just work on Sundays, but I'll work 24 hours a day because I get double time. And I'll make more on a Sunday. And they're the two options. And I ponder over them and argue over them. What's the real solution? The real solution is to get rid of the car, get a new taxi. And it's the same with the economy. The economic issues are systemic. They're system problems. They're a problem with the current system. So you can't solve them by pumping money in or borrowing money or tax spend. It's a systemic problem which has been around for centuries. Okay? So what is being concealed in such a debate? Because this is what phony bones of contention do. They conceal the real solution. Okay? Now, the real solution to the economic issues is a lecture in itself. Okay? But just to summarise, to end fractional reserve banking and usury, and to allow governments to issue currency debt-free. That's it in a nutshell, okay? But they would never discuss that on a programme like Question Time. But there's actually a second thing which is being concealed. Because the solution is reasonably simple to the economic debt that we're in, right? It's written there, right? That leads you to another thing that they're concealing, which is that the debt isn't an accident. It's not an accident, in my opinion. It's been done deliberately. If you put someone in debt, whether it be a company or a country or an individual, you're not necessarily putting them in debt because you want that money back. You might be putting them in debt to permanently disempower them and control them, right? So I don't think the debt is an accident. I think it's a control mechanism. But they would never allow any individual on Question Time to actually express that view, because the people who ultimately control the banking system decide who gets on Question Time. Now, another thing that they keep going on about is we need, and all parties say this, all parties come up with this, even the Green Party. Economic growth is good and we need to try and increase GDP to get out of debt. Really? So we need to consume more stuff and that's going to get us out of debt? Does that sound right to you? It's a bit like saying if you have a company, because GDP is equivalent to turnover in a company, if you increase a company's turnover, will it automatically make more profit so it could pay off debt? Not necessarily. And there's another flaw in this argument, which is that, let's say that you did increase GDP, so you've got more wealth and you print more money to represent that wealth. Well, you can only use that money to pay off debt if the money is printed debt-free, so it doesn't have to be paid back. But when they issue it as a loan. So there's flaws in this statement. But again, there's something a lot more sinister behind this statement, and it was pointed out by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his 1969 book, Between Two Ages. Now, this guy is still an advisor to Barack Obama, and he's been an advisor to other American presidents. And in '69 he said, "The challenge for governments in the future will be to prevent man from effectively discovering his true self and keeping humanity locked into consumerist materialism." What the flippin' heck is he talking about? Preventing man from effectively discovering his true self. Well, I'm going to try and explain what Brzezinski's talking about with an economics lesson, but it's an economics lesson you will not see in any school, because it's an economics lesson without reference to the word money, okay? Because money is just a means to an end. Money is like the oil in an engine. It goes round and round and round and round. If you're just watching the oil in an engine, you don't know where the car's going. You don't know the purpose of the journey or the agenda for that journey. That's all money is. It's a means to an end. So remove money out of the equation, and then let's have a look at the economics. Okay, what's more important than money in an economy? Well, I would suggest time is very important. This blue bar represents the amount of time that you've got in any one particular week. So you can split that up into your work time and your free time. Now, what else is important in an economy? Well, I've just called it stuff. Okay, you go to work to get your stuff. All right. Now, we can split stuff up into stuff that you need and stuff that you want. Stuff that you need is stuff that if you didn't have, you might die. So food, clean water, shelter, clothing perhaps. Stuff that you want is all of the luxury goods that we love and crave. iPads, fast cars, you name it. Sky football, the list is endless and growing. Now, you can split work up into the amount of time it would take you to get the stuff that you need and the amount of time it would take you to work to get the stuff that you want. Alright? I've also split free time up into consumption, because if we're consuming all of this stuff, we need time to consume it. We need time to watch our Sky Football or whatever it is that we're doing. And then there's our free time. This is very important. Free time where you will learn, or you will become political, or you will be critical. This is where you'll, as Brzezinski says, discover who you truly are. Now, let's go back 600 years and draw the chart for a typical person, because it would look very different to that. And just to point out that in the modern age, really, probably only 10% of our time is actually spent working for the stuff that we need. If you actually list all of the products consumed in any one year, less than 10% are stuff that keep you alive. Okay, so let's go back before the Industrial Revolution. It's going to look more like this. So the vast majority of people's time will be spent to get the stuff that they need to live. And they would spend very little time actually on luxury goods. So let's just say we could go back in time and speak to them. And we say to them, hey, it's great in the future because we only spend 10% of our time to get all the stuff that we need. And the person in the past would say, really? Must be great in the future. You must have loads of free time on your hand. And we'd scratch our head and say, well, no, we haven't actually. Why is that? Strange. Well, it's because the stuff that we want has been mushroomed out of all proportion. Needs have been created which didn't exist in the past. All of the consumption that we have that isn't really necessary. I was in a shop the other day and I said to the woman behind the counter, this shop should be called Things I Can Live Without. It wasn't my idea to go in the shop, by the way. I was dragged there. Anyway, so this is what Brzezinski's talking about, because what Brzezinski sees as the threat is he doesn't want this box to grow, because if you spend less time working, you're going to have lots of free time on your hand to discover who you truly are. So he says, let's keep everyone running around, working, and in order to do that, we need to keep them consuming. All right? Now, just a word about debt. Debt occurs in our model here when the amount of things that you want exceeds the amount of work time required to obtain it. And a lot of people fall into personal debt. It's so easy these days. And getting someone in personal debt is a great way of keeping them, as Zabinski says, locked into consumerist materialism. Now, a lot of people would say, yeah, and this is what marketing has done. This is sales and marketing that make people want things that they don't really need. Maybe. Bill Hicks once said, anyone here working sales and marketing? Kill yourself. I would only partly agree with him, because I actually think the way marketing works is that it makes people feel dissatisfied with the amount and value of stuff that they have, yeah? So that they want something better. I would argue that practically every show on TV does that. They don't need marketing. It makes you feel dissatisfied with your house. That's what TV does. It makes you feel dissatisfied with what's in your house. It makes you feel dissatisfied with the car that you drive. It makes you feel dissatisfied with the food that you eat. It makes you feel dissatisfied that you're not a pop star. It makes you feel dissatisfied you're not an executive. It makes you feel dissatisfied you're not an entrepreneur. How many programs on TV actually work on making you feel content with what you can realistically achieve and celebrating that? I can't think of any. They all psychologically make you want more. And this is what Zbigniew Brzezinski was talking about. So, the statement that all political parties come out with, economic growth is good and we should all try and increase GDP, really? Really? If you want to permanently enslave yourself purely for the purposes of unbridled consumption, then that statement is true. But I don't want to do that, because I want some free time to discover who I truly am. Now, you might be sitting there a bit smug saying, well, he's not talking about me here because I haven't got any debt. I live well within my means. Well, they've thought about people like you. Because there are 30 million taxpayers in the UK. And the current debt, took me a while to get these notes right, the current government debt is 1.4 trillion. Now that's a bit of a misnomer, government debt. What that is taxpayer debt. Because the government's going to get it from taxpayers. UK taxpayer debt is 1.4 trillion. So if you divide 30 million into 1.4 trillion, you get just under £47,000 each. Right? So that's debt. That's your debt that the government's holding on your behalf. Right? So if you haven't got that much spare, then you're in debt as well. And remember, it's not an accident. In my opinion, it's not an accident. It's a control mechanism. So why are they doing this? Why are they pushing national governments? And all national governments seem to have debt. Personal debt, I think it's a control mechanism. I don't like to try and predict what they're trying to do because they don't invite me to their tea parties, right? These people who orchestrate this. But I'm pretty certain that it is orchestrated, it's deliberate. We might see whole countries going bankrupt so that they can then be taken into a more central political structure, the New World Order that people talk about. That's perhaps what's going on here. But as I say, you won't see someone on Question Time actually make the statement that it's all deliberate. It's not accidental economic cycles that create the debt. I don't buy that for 1 second. How could the system be changed? Remove central banks, allow the government to create the currency itself at no debt with no interest. Get rid of usury altogether, control inflation by controlling the amount of money in the economy. And I'm just going to finish with the statement that I started with, that he who borrows sells his freedom. Thanks for listening.